Welcome back everybody, my name is Nick930 and today I want to share with you the complete history of one of my all-time favorite game franchises, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater is a video game series that lets players skateboard around open-ended levels while performing tricks and completing challenges. The series is known for its solid gameplay mechanics, great controls, tight level design, and iconic soundtracks. But after Activision milked the series dry with yearly releases, the franchise became stagnant and never managed to recapture the glory days of the early 2000s. So what happened to this once iconic video game series? Well, to answer that, we're going to have to roll way back to 1999 with the franchise's first outing, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. In the late 90s, the skateboarding scene was building up a lot of attention, especially with major pro skaters like Tony Hawk owning the spotlight. Activision wanted to jump on the skateboard video game bandwagon and have their own series of games like Sega's Top Skater. They contracted the studio Neversoft, who brought over assets from their previous title Apocalypse, to help reinvent the video game skateboarding scene. Instead of making a skateboarding game with linear levels and a race mentality, Neversoft opted for a more open-ended approach, with arena-style levels and a focus on performing tricks and stunts. An early prototype build was made and featured a Bruce Willis character model that they had used in their previous game. To help sell this new skating game, Activision and Neversoft contacted the biggest name in skateboarding at the time, Tony Hawk. Hawk loved the work that was being put into the game and directly endorsed it. He was an asset not only for his brand recognition, but also his direct input that helped steer the game in the right direction. He recommended other professional skaters to be added to the game, and assisted in the concept designs for the game character's movement and style. The studio tried to utilize motion capture technology, but it ended up being more trouble than it was worth, and a lot of the animations were done from scratch, resulting in a lot of stiff animations seen in the game now. The famous 900 move was actually thrown into the game last minute, as Tony Hawk had only just landed the move that summer, a stunt that would go on to greatly help the video game series' initial sales due to Tony Hawk's massive boost in popularity. In the fall of 1999, Tony Hawk Pro Skater finally hit the shelves for the Sony PlayStation 1. The game featured 10 playable skaters including Tony Hawk, Bob Burnquist, Bucky Lasek, and Elisa Streamer, with a secret character, Officer Dick, being awarded to players who completed the game 100% with a single character. There was another secret character, Private Carrera, but she's only unlockable by using a cheat code. The game featured some very basic moves like jumping or ollieing, grinding, flip tricks, and grab tricks. If a player managed to successfully land several tricks without falling, they would build up a special meter, which, when full, could be used to trigger special high-scoring tricks like Tony Hawk's 900. Some tricks could only be performed by certain characters, requiring a mastery of each individual skater's style. There were 9 levels in total to play through, including the classic warehouse, a school, a few skate parks, and even some downhill levels directly inspired by the classic Top Skater arcade game. The game's main career had you using a pro skater and completing 5 increasingly difficult challenges across 9 levels, each with a 2-minute time limit. Completing a challenge earned you a VHS tape, and earning enough of these tapes gave players access to newer levels and improved player stats. You could swap between different skateboard decks and adjust the tightness of the skateboard's trucks to fine-tune your steering, but outside of that, the original game didn't feature much in terms of player customization. Outside of the career mode, you could play single sessions, which let you play any unlocked level with a 2-minute timer, or free skate, which gave you unlimited time to explore. If you had a friend nearby, you could also play 2-player split screen and compete for high scores in Trick Attack. There was also a classic game of Horse and Graffiti, which had players running around trying to trick off as many skatable surfaces as possible. The game's soundtrack was also insanely catchy, with punk rock songs like Goldfinger's Superman and the Suicide Machine's New Girl playing throughout each level. The song choices used in this and following Tony Hawk games would go on to define the series' distinct style and attitude, and help to popularize the punk rock scene to some degree. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was hugely successful and would soon find life on other platforms like the Nintendo 64, Game Boy Color, Dreamcast, and the N-Gage in the early 2000s. The Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise was a massive win for Activision and Neversoft, and soon after the game's initial release, work began on a sequel. Soon after the success of the original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game, Activision acquired Neversoft, and production proceeded for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. Pro Skater 2 used the same engine as the original game and would simply expand the game's features by adding new levels, new tricks, and an even more catchy soundtrack. The game would also feature far more player customization, including a custom skater option, and even a park editor that let you create your own levels from scratch using preset ramps and rails. The game's campaign was completely revamped with far more challenges per level, and a new progression system based around finding and earning cash rewards. Each level had hidden cash icons that would float on top of elevated rails or high above ramps, and earning this cash would give players opportunities to enhance their players' stats, or edit some of the tricks like grabs, flip tricks, and specials. Other new abilities include the ability to switch your stance, nollie, more grind tricks like the feeble and crooked, and most important, the manual. The manual was originally planned for the original game, but was scrapped late in development. This move allowed players to connect combos from rails to ramps, which pushed the difficulty curve a bit further and allowed for much more complex gameplay. Because of this, the game's difficulty overall was increased, with higher trick score requirements and a ton more unlockable secret content. Tony Hawk 2 featured almost all of the original skater characters with the addition of some newcomers like Rodney Mullen and Eric Costin. Officer Dick and Private Carrera also make a return in addition to the fan-favorite secret character, Spider-Man. Tony Hawk 2 featured 8 levels including the Hangar, School 2, Venice Beach, Philadelphia, and the Bull Ring, which featured a huge loop-to-loop obstacle. In addition to these 8 levels, players were also given 2 more secret levels for completing 100% of the game with every character. The first was the Chopper Drop, based on a real-world stunt where a skater dropped out of a helicopter into a half-pipe on a barge. And the second is the insane Skate Heaven, which is a series of huge ramps, rails, and even Tony Hawk's private home ramps floating in space. Tony Hawk 2 also featured one of the best soundtracks in the entire franchise, with songs like Guerrilla Radio by Rage Against the Machine, You by Bad Religion, and When Worlds Collide by Powerman 5000. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 was even more successful than the original game, earning high scores from nearly every journalist, and I kid you not, is the number 2 video game of all time on Metacritic even to this day. Just like the original game, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 would also be available for subsequent Nintendo platforms and would also be the very first entry to see a PC release as well. Only a year later, Neversoft released the follow-up to the hugely successful Tony Hawk series with their first step into the next generation, with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Tony Hawk 3 featured a massive overhaul of the game's visuals, animations, and even tighter controls. Though, if you are like me and didn't upgrade to the new platform just yet, Tony Hawk 3 on the original PlayStation was much like the original 2 games. No matter what platform you played on though, Tony Hawk 3 introduced a ton of game-changing features. One of the biggest additions was the Revert, which allowed players to land from pipe ramps and connect seamlessly into a manual, allowing for truly endless combos, assuming you can maintain your balance. Some tricks also had a few additional enhancements like double kickflips, which would later be expanded into the standardized double trick system in later games. Another notable addition to the game was the lip trick balance bar. In the past 2 games, performing a lip trick was suicide because you never knew how long you were able to hold the trick before your character just decided to bail. Now, with a simple balancing bar, lip tricks handle much like grinding in manuals, and were a more effective tool for earning points. The annoying big drop punishment feature was also removed from the new-gen versions of Tony Hawk 3, meaning you can now jump from any height without automatically bailing like in Tony Hawk 2. And finally, Tony Hawk 3 was the very first game to feature an online multiplayer component, and is one of the very first online-capable PlayStation video games ever made, but this feature was only available on the PlayStation 2 and PC versions of the game. The differences don't stop there though. The PC and PS2 versions were significantly better versions of this game, as they featured much better graphics, smoother frame rates, cleaner animations, and more detailed environments. Each level featured more dynamic environments, including challenges that resulted in a permanent change to the level design, like causing an earthquake or opening an elevator door. Tony Hawk 3 would also be the very first game in the series to feature random pedestrians that would either cheer you on or even knock you over if you ran into them. Tony Hawk 3 featured 8 levels, with very different secret levels depending on the platform you played on. The original 8 levels include the Foundry, the Airport, Los Angeles, Canada, and Tokyo. The PS2 and PC version of the game featured a secret cruise ship and 3 remade levels from the original game, Warehouse, Burnside, and Roswell. The Xbox version featured the oil rig, which would later appear in Tony Hawk's American Wasteland, and the PlayStation 1 version of the game featured a downhill level at the base of the Statue of God in Rio de Janeiro. Available skaters were also different between the many platforms. All platforms had access to many of the original cast, with newcomers like Bam Margera, but there were now far more secret characters than ever before. The next-gen version of the game featured Darth Maul, Wolverine, Officer Dick, Private Carrera, Ollie the Magic Bum, a character initially from a goal in Tony Hawk 2, Kelly Slater from some surfing game, and even the Neversoft Eyeball. If you had the game on the PC, you could unlock a Doom Guy, and on Xbox, you could unlock a skeleton named X-Ray. The soundtrack was once again a big selling point for the game, but isn't nearly as edgy as the previous entries in the series. Notable additions include Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones, Check by Zebrahead, and 96 Quite Bitter Beings from CKY. Tony Hawk 3 was again received extremely well by critics, with a perfect score from GameSpot and is one of the highest rated PS2 games of all time. Starting to realize that their formula was going to get stale soon, Neversoft made some huge changes for the upcoming sequel, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, that would permanently shift the franchise into an entirely different direction. While the core gameplay mechanics remained mostly intact from Tony Hawk 3, Tony Hawk 4 would completely redesign the game's main career mode, and remove the original 2-minute timer from the game. Levels were now open to explore much like free mode, and goals needed to be activated by interacting with triggers, whether it be a pedestrian on the new gen versions of the game, or floating colored tokens on old gen. Goals generally involved the same as before, like collecting the hidden skate letters or competing in competitions. But new to Tony Hawk 4 was the combo goal, which required players to collect each of the 5 letters in combo without ending their trick. Goals in general were significantly more difficult this time around, and levels featured an insane amount of challenges when compared to previous entries. On top of this new open-ended design, Tony Hawk 4 also introduced new tricks, including an extension of the double tap tricks introduced in Tony Hawk 3. You could also now perform extensions that allowed players to switch their grind, lip, or manual without needing to jump in the air first. Players could now skitch behind vehicles, meaning they could grab onto the back of a moving car or even animal and were forced to balance much like a grind. Players could also wally plant during a wall ride, allowing them to reach higher railings along walls, and the level out feature was added, letting players level out their character if they find themselves flying sideways over a flat surface. One of the most important new moves was the spine transfer, which allowed players to smoothly transition to a parallel quarter pipe, which really helped to streamline the movement and controls. Tony Hawk 4 featured 7 levels, but were significantly larger in scope than anything in the series up to this point. Levels included the College, a newer version of San Francisco, Alcatraz, London, and the Kona skate park. Just like in Tony Hawk 3, there's a few different levels between version types, with the new gen version of the game getting a carnival, a zoo, and a level from Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX, and the old gen version getting the sewers and Little Big World, which is probably one of the strangest levels in the series so far. Just like the levels, the characters were also very different between versions. Most of the same pro skaters return, with no notable new additions, but there's several new secret characters including Mike Valley, Django Fett, Daisy, and the mascot Eddie from the band Iron Maiden. The PS1 version of the game featured an exclusive miniature clown character called Little Person, but that was it. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 was once again met with high review scores, with reviewers appreciating the increased difficulty and much larger scope, but they did complain about the lack of graphical innovation. In 2003, Neversoft finally reached the Tony Hawk series' peak, with easily the best entry in the entire franchise and my personal favorite, Tony Hawk's Underground. Tony Hawk's Underground took everything it learned from previous entries and expanded upon it with an insane amount of available tricks, large open-ended levels, a gigantic collection of characters, and the biggest soundtrack in the series to date. The game's customization was taken to new extremes, with players capable of not only creating their own custom character and levels, but also being able to create their own custom tricks, and even customize the board itself with a livery editor. You could even import a photograph of your actual face into the game and use it on your custom character, a feature that was pretty gimmicky, and it wouldn't return in the series after a while. Underground's campaign is the first in the series to feature a cohesive storyline, which forces players to use their own custom character and experience the journey from a crappy poor Jersey neighborhood street punk to pro skater. Along the way, players would interact with real famous skaters like Chad Buska, Mike Valley, and Tony Hawk, and accomplish various tasks in open-ended levels much like Tony Hawk 4. Alongside your character was Eric Sparrow, your childhood best friend that turns into a huge jerk halfway through and attempts to steal your fame. The storyline is pretty cheesy, but was unprecedented for a skateboarding game at the time and added a huge amount of depth to a series that previously was only about getting a high score. Just like every other Tony Hawk game prior, Tony Hawk's Underground introduced some huge improvements to the gameplay, with brand new moves like the wall plant, pressure flips, and double tap grind tricks. The biggest addition to the game though was the ability to finally get off of your skateboard and walk around on foot. This feature made navigating the environment infinitely more enjoyable, as you no longer were awkwardly stuck at the bottom of staircases or forced to move at high speeds just to get to a cool skate spot. Players now had more freedom to really skate on anything they wanted, as long as they could find a way to climb onto it. This new walking ability also could be combined with tricks, with a combo run-out clock appearing and letting players run from point to point without breaking their combo. Players could also acid drop into quarter pipes or jump directly onto grinds if they wanted to. Underground also introduced some unnecessary additions like the ability to drive vehicles during some missions, with poorly done driving animations and awkward physics, but they did offer a fun distraction and helped to make the campaign more interesting to play through. Underground featured 9 levels to play through, including New Jersey, Manhattan, Hawaii, Moscow, and even a live Kiss concert, which is probably one of the weakest secret levels in a Tony Hawk game. In addition to these though, there were 3 secret classic levels that could be unlocked by finding difficult to find secret tapes. These secret levels included a remake of Hangar, School 2, and Venice from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. While the game required you to use a custom skater in the main campaign, players had the option to use a large number of pro skaters and secret characters in the free mode or multiplayer mode. Skaters include all of the classics and include newcomers like Paul Rodriguez and Ardo Sari. Secret characters included every member of the rock band Kiss, Marvel's Iron Man, several NPCs and characters from the game's campaign, and Thud, a parody of the classic horror movie monster Chud. This character can also be seen eating Eric at the beginning of the game's Neversoft logo, which is good because Eric freaking sucks. Underground's soundtrack is probably one of my absolute favorites in this franchise, and it includes songs like Big Bang by Bad Religion, Like the Angel by Rise Against, and Separation of Church and Skate by NoFX. Tony Hawk's Underground would also mark the first time the game would not be featured on the original PlayStation console, and was only available on the Xbox, PS2, GameCube, and a separate mobile version was also made for the Game Boy Advance. Tony Hawk's Underground was mostly successful, but wasn't as highly regarded by everyone. Many stated that the graphics were showing their age, and that the story, while an interesting and solid design choice, ended up hurting the game's potential replay value. Tony Hawk's Underground, despite being one of the most solid and complete entries in the series, was also the very peak of this franchise's success, and from here on out, the games would only get worse. In 2004, Neversoft returned with a direct sequel to Underground called Tony Hawk's Underground 2. Underground 2 is at its core very similar to the original Underground. All the game's controls, tricks, and open-ended gameplay remain intact, but there was also a distinct shift in the game's attitude. And I think a big part of why it feels this way is because the game's obvious inspiration from films like Jackass and the subsequent Viva La Bam television show on MTV. Underground 2, just like the first game, features a full narrative in its campaign mode, only this time you're part of a ragtag bunch of celebrities, many of which appear in the aforementioned shows like Wee Man and Bam Margera. The focus of the story has shifted completely from becoming a pro skater to just destroying landmarks at various famous cities. The game's attitude shifted more to a comedic atmosphere, with silly Easter eggs hidden in every level and non-stop immature humor. Even the game's visuals have a bit more of a cartoony approach to them, with stumpier looking character models and a more colorful tone. New features include the Nada Spin, which has you rotating around poles for some reason, flips and rolls, which could be performed alongside any standard air trick, the Freak Out, which lets you tap the grind button repeatedly when you bail so that you can smash your board in some crazy way, and the ability to spray paint graffiti. None of the new features really add anything worthwhile to the experience, and it was clear that Neversoft had finally reached the tipping point in terms of what they could do with the game's moveset. Levels include a remake of the original warehouse level from Tony Hawk 1, Boston, Berlin, New Orleans, and the outdoor Skatopia, which allowed players to freely skate on grass terrain without penalty. Each level featured unique opportunities to destroy the environment, often resulting in new combo lines to be utilized. For example, you could light your board on fire in Boston and then light the cannons to destroy a nearby construction site. Or unleash demons in New Orleans from a graveyard, causing the entire city to be invaded by zombies and monsters. Underground 2 never really took itself seriously, and because of this, it was a very enjoyable game to play. In addition to these default levels, there were also 2 secret levels that could be unlocked for completing the game, including the Triangle, which presumably takes place in the Bermuda Triangle, complete with wrecked ships, planes, and alien spaceship, and PROSKATER, an even stranger level that has you teleporting between a space station, an ancient temple, and multiple layers of hell. To try and appeal to some of their older fans, Neversoft also included a classic mode to Underground 2, which featured original levels from the first 3 games, remastered with new visuals, and a new set of challenges that needed to be completed within a 2-minute timer. Underground 2 featured a total of 15 levels, making it one of the biggest games in the franchise, right behind the lesser-known Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2X that was exclusive to Xbox back in 2001. Tony Hawk Underground 2 was the first entry to get average reviews, sitting in at around 70 to 80% overall, with many reviewers knocking the game for having few new moves, an immature storyline, and a less interesting soundtrack. Apparently not learning their lesson, Neversoft pushed on in 2005 with their next entry to the franchise called Tony Hawk's American Wasteland. American Wasteland dropped the bar even lower for this once great franchise, with more pointless gimmicks, another odd shift in art direction, and really bad level design. First, we need to talk about the gimmicks. The biggest one was the game's claim to not have any loading screens. Right off the bat, this has proven to be false, as you need to sit through a loading screen to get to any of the game modes. The actual claim actually referred to the campaign though, which again is not really true either. Sure, there's no loading screen with a progress bar that appears on screen as you escape from one area to the other, but that's because between each level there's a long empty hallway you're forced to skate down, with a few railings and kicker ramps set up. You can even feel the game stuttering as it tries to load the next area. But even this would have been excusable had the actual levels been enjoyable to skate in. American Wasteland, unlike the past entries in the franchise, takes place only in Los Angeles. Levels include Hollywood, East LA, Santa Monica, and various skate parks throughout, but none of them have the tight flow and consistency of anything seen in previous games. Levels felt claustrophobic and confusing, and the scaling felt off, with everything around the player feeling way too small. New features include the ability to ride a BMX, complete with its own set of tricks and controls, and some new parkour abilities, allowing your character to get off his board and flip off of walls. There was also the Burt Slide and a few other minor additions to the skateboarding gameplay, but nothing that really changed the feel of the experience. The game's story tasks the player with running around Los Angeles and causing destruction, only now you're trying to do so in order to steal large pieces of scrap metal to bring to your own skate park. This sounds like a cool idea on paper, but unfortunately, when you're finally done with the game and you complete your giant collection of garbage, you're just stuck with a giant pile of garbage for a level. Nothing about the skate ranch is fun to skate on, making it the most disappointing payoff ever. The experience was pretty lackluster too, with missions being way too easy than ever before, and the campaign being incredibly short. American Wasteland also featured the return of Classic Mode, with a few classic levels from old games being remastered like the Mall and downtown Minneapolis, and also some brand new levels like Kyoto and the Ruins. But again, just like American Wasteland's main levels, all these new levels feel strangely small and claustrophobic. The game's visual direction and overall attitude had shifted as well, with more of a focus on a new age punk style, from the game's font and UI to the game's music choices. The only song I can even remember from the soundtrack was Holiday by Green Day, and it just doesn't feel right in a Tony Hawk game. American Wasteland was a huge disappointment to me when it released, and evidently the critics weren't impressed either. Many praised the story for leaving the nonsense of Underground 2 behind and returning to a story focused on skateboarding, but most criticized the game's overly simplistic design. American Wasteland was also the first game in the series to be offered on the Xbox 360, and as the series moved on to the newer gen consoles, the franchise would only fall further. In 2006, prior to their next main entry to the series, Neversoft developed a spin-off title called Downhill Jam, a launch title for the Nintendo Wii. Downhill Jam would eventually find its way to other platforms including the PlayStation 2 later that same year. Unlike other Tony Hawk games, Downhill Jam forced players to race downhill in race courses much like the original inspiration for the series. Players could still grind, perform basic flip tricks and grab tricks, but a ton of the core mechanics that had been developed since Tony Hawk 3 were removed, and replaced with features that felt out of place in the series. The game put an emphasis on punching random pedestrians and other racers to fill a boost meter to help win races, and all of Tony Hawk's dialogue felt out of character, with him just saying things like this.
Winning. Is there any other way to skate?
Downhill Jam received mixed reviews and seemed like a pointless entry to the franchise. Within the same year, Tony Hawk's Project 8 would release, and would feature some of the biggest changes to the series to date. Thanks to the power of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, Project 8 featured a massive leap in terms of graphics, in addition to a brand new set of highly realistic physics and character animations. Each skater had their own specific style mapped to their model using sophisticated motion capture technology, which looks great even to this day. But to accompany this new, more realistic animation design, the gameplay needed to be slowed down considerably, and several moves were either changed or removed entirely. Thankfully, most of the game's mechanics that were removed were the pointless gimmicks added in Underground 2 and American Wasteland, and all of the core mechanics like manuals, reverts, and basic trick extensions remain intact. But again, fans would need to readjust to the new physics if they wanted to pull off their huge combos like before. New to Project 8 was the Nailed the Trick mechanic that allowed players to jump in the air and directly control the skater's feet and kick the board in any direction that they wanted, adding a new level of immersion to the experience. This feature could be coupled with all of the same standard Tony Hawk gameplay mechanics and made for some really cool looking moments. Another new feature is the ability to measure the amount of damage you take from a fall with a hospital bill notification. This doesn't really do much to affect the gameplay outside of being used in some challenges, and it feels really inconsistent thanks to the game's new ragdoll physics, often propelling the player at unrealistic speeds. But it's still fun either way, and doesn't hurt the gameplay. The game's story also took a few steps back from the more scripted narrative of past entries in favor of a more open-ended approach. Players needed to choose a character from a small selection of presets with very limited customization options, and then begin completing various tasks around a large open-ended level. Completing enough tasks unlocked opportunities to unlock new skatable areas, impress local skaters, and compete in competitions to earn new sponsorships. It was nice to be given more free reign and allowed to explore at your own pace, but it was admittedly not as good of a story as the Underground games. The redeeming factor here was Project 8's excellent map design. Neversoft once again opted for an open-ended singular level with no load times, only this time they managed to actually deliver just that. The game world feels like one huge cohesive skate park with an insane amount of well-made combo lines that are addicting to skate through. Each area also had a distinct theme to them that made them easy to distinguish. There was the suburbs, a large skate park, downtown, the capital, a high school, and even a huge theme park complete with tons of colorful ramps and scenery. One thing that surprised me most with Project 8 was its difficulty. This game is probably one of the most difficult games in the series. I take it Neversoft heard the complaints with American Wasteland's incredibly easy goals and cranked this difficulty through the roof. Each challenge now has 3 tiers, Amateur, Pro, and Sick, and naturally I thought I would be able to handle the Sick requirements, but found myself often coming short by a large margin on almost every goal, whether it be insanely high scores within a short time frame, or seemingly simple but difficult tricks down sets of stairs. It was a welcome change, and one that likely tested even the most seasoned Tony Hawk players. Project 8 was a surprisingly well-made game, with some great level designs, a balanced difficulty curve, excellent new animations, and fun gameplay. The game received decent reviews overall and was a bit of a step up from American Wasteland, but the slower pace did feel like an odd step for the series, and Neversoft would attempt to scale it back a little bit with the next entry. 2007's Tony Hawk's Proving Ground only further pushed fans away, with another uninspired entry that did little to evolve the franchise. New features included Nail a Grab and Nail a Manual, an extension of the Nail a Trick mechanic introduced in Project 8. The park editor was integrated more seamlessly into the game's single-player campaign, with players able to set up basic ramps and rails anywhere they wanted in the game world, or even customize a huge empty warehouse to build their ultimate dream park. The game's narrative was changed up a bit, with a fully voiced lead protagonist attempting to make it big by mastering 3 distinct disciplines of skateboarding, including career, hardcore, and rigor. Career goals focus on making it big and famous, by entering competitions and trying to gain fame through promotion. Hardcore goals focus more on the underground lifestyle, with objectives involving breaking into skate parks and beating people up with your board. And rigor goals involve moving ramps around the level manually and setting up lines to complete challenges. Outside of completing these challenges, the story still falls short, and is hardly memorable just like the past entry. Project 8's more realistic gameplay style was scaled back slightly in Proving Grounds, with the camera zoomed out slightly more and a bit faster gameplay. Players could now manually push off of the ground for a large amount of speed, and animations were sped up to feel more streamlined as you hop from rail to rail. One unwelcome change was the new design of the game's balancing meters, which now appeared as gigantic slightly transparent blocks on either side of the screen, that would change color depending on their status. Other new features included the ability to carve and slash along pipe walls, which add absolutely nothing to the gameplay, and I constantly forgot how to even perform these moves. But the biggest problem with Proving Ground was the terrible level design and visual direction. Rather than trying to follow up Project 8's colorful setting and well-made, interconnected, and interesting open-world level design, Proving Ground opted to return to connecting large city areas with boring long hallways like American Wasteland, and every area looked practically the same. There was Philadelphia, Washington DC, and Baltimore, and nothing really helped these 3 areas stand out aside from being able to see the Washington Monument or the old Philadelphia fountain from Tony Hawk 2. On top of this, the entire game's art direction took on a darker, grittier tone, with the color feeling practically absent. It's the most drab-looking entry in the franchise so far, and it just feels out of place, especially considering how often you can body check random pedestrians and send them flying across the level. Proving Grounds was a lackluster entry that really failed to add anything interesting to the franchise, despite Project 8 doing so many new and interesting things. It's a shame, but Proving Grounds would be Neversoft's last Tony Hawk game. From now on, the Tony Hawk franchise would be handled by Robomoto, the team responsible for effectively ruining everything having to do with the Tony Hawk's gaming franchise. After the first year-long break the franchise had ever seen, Tony Hawk Ride released, and was the biggest disaster the series had ever seen. Trying to jump on the motion control bandwagon, Tony Hawk Ride did away with the standard controls of a normal Tony Hawk game, and required gamers to buy a special skateboard peripheral controller, only compatible with this one game. The game performed terribly, selling only around 100,000 copies, and earned miserable reviews all around. And for some reason, Robomoto, Activision, and Tony Hawk still pushed through with their sequel, likely trying to justify all the money that went into R&D for the dumb peripheral. In 2010, Tony Hawk's Shred released with the same story as before. Only this game sold even worse than the first game, with only 3,000 copies sold in the first week. Shred offered a new snowboarding mode, but not really much else. Their series was put on hold soon after this game's monumental failure. In 2012, Robomoto learned their lesson and decided to scrap the peripheral controller idea forever, and also decided to scrap a ton of other features that had been developed over the course of the past decade with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD. Pro Skater HD was a remake of the original 3 games with a handful of classic levels returning with improved visuals and new goals. It wasn't sold as an official physical copy and was only made available digitally through PSN, Xbox Live, and Steam, and was made using the Unreal 3 engine. And while the game definitely looks better than the original trilogy of games, there were a few problems that fans did not appreciate. First off, the game's physics felt off, making for some unstable gameplay. In addition to this, the game was filled with bugs that made the experience a chore at times. The soundtrack managed to feature some classics like Superman by Goldfinger, but the newer song choices felt out of place and failed to capture the game's original attitude. According to Hawk, he wanted to introduce gamers to newer music just like he had done back in the early 2000s, but most gamers interested in this HD remake only wanted to hear the old stuff. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD received mixed overall reviews and would have been a fine end for the entire series, but even that moderate amount of success kept Robomoto and Activision optimistic, and the licensing contract with Tony Hawk had still yet to expire. Skipping over the cancelled Shred Session Endless Runner game that never saw the light of day, we have the absolute final nail in the coffin for this franchise, and probably one of the lowest rated titles in this current console generation: Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. Tony Hawk 5 aimed to return to the series' roots with a focus on skateboarding and pulling off big tricks and combos, but also decided to try and stand out with its inclusion of needless power-ups thrown into every level. The game was designed to be always online, featuring other online players skating around as you try to complete challenges. You could choose to ignore them, skate competitively against them, or even work together to complete goals. The game's mechanics remain mostly the same as Pro Skater HD, but with changes to the way players maintain their speed, and a new slam move to grind on objects more fluidly. Unfortunately, the game was plagued with developmental issues, forcing the game's art style to shift to a more vibrant and cartoony appearance to help maintain a steady frame rate, and the game was so broken on release that players couldn't even proceed past the initial level. The balance meters were broken, and the game required 2 8GB patches just to be playable. Tony Hawk 5 is still considered the worst title in the entire franchise, which is insane considering there's 2 games that require you to buy a stupid peripheral skateboard, and unfortunately will be the final official release in the franchise, as the licensing contract with Tony Hawk himself has finally expired, and Neversoft, the original development team behind this once great franchise, burned their iconic skewered eyeball sculpture after their studio shut down in 2014. But then there was light, as loyal community members that have been with the Tony Hawk online gaming community since it began with Tony Hawk 3 just refused to let this awesome skateboarding game series die. Using the engine from Tony Hawk's Underground 2, some loyal modders have managed to create a free-to-play modification for the PC version of Thug 2 that includes the biggest collection of levels, skaters, and customization out of anything in the entire franchise. Any level found in the series from Tony Hawk 3 all the way up to Project 8 has been included, with little to no load times in between, in addition to full widescreen support, enhanced visuals, and an unbelievable amount of player customization to suit every player's favorite Tony Hawk playstyle. Not only this, but the community is still active to this day, playing online in the most competitive trick attack rounds you'll ever see, with combos that can last nearly half an hour. If you're a huge fan of the Tony Hawk franchise when it was still in its prime, then you owe it to yourself to pick up a copy of Underground 2 on the PC and try out this mod. There's even custom-made levels that you can easily import into the game for a never-ending amount of content. Seems like a much better send-off for the series than Tony Hawk 5. And that about wraps it up. The Tony Hawk franchise is a hugely iconic video game series that, despite some horrible late entries, still had an insanely impressive run of non-stop quality games. Neversoft managed to squeeze every little bit of innovation they could out of such a simple idea, and likely helped shape the culture in the early 2000s with the way it exposed youth to a ton of great music. Like most Activision-owned franchises, the series was forcibly milked dry until it finally fell flat on its face, and will likely never see a return to form for this gaming giant for a very long time. But it will still firmly remain an important part of gaming history, and one of my all-time favorite series. Thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this look back at the Tony Hawk franchise. If you'd like to see more videos like this, check out the rest of my channel, and be sure to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.